I never thought I would end up here, on this forgotten stretch of coast, with nothing but the wind, the sea, and a lighthouse that seemed to lean a little too far toward the jagged rocks below. My name is, well, it doesn't matter. Names rarely matter when the world has already decided to forget you. I took this job not for money, though it pays well enough, but for silence, for isolation, for the quiet hum of the ocean that drowns out the rest of the world. That's what I told myself, anyway. On the long drive that cut through cliffs and fog like a blade, the lighthouse stands taller than I expected. Its white paint is chipped and weathered, the iron railing black with rust. The glass at the top, once clear, is now clouded with salt and years of storms. Standing there, I could feel the weight of every storm it had survived, every sailor it had warned, every secret it had kept. The wind tugged at my coat, sharp and cold, carrying the faint scent of decay from the shoreline. I shivered, though it wasn't entirely from the cold. I had been alone for most of my life, drifting from one city to another, one apartment to another. People never stayed long, places never felt like home. So when the notice appeared in the local employment board, caretaker wanted, lighthouse keeper needed, no previous experience required, I was drawn to it. Not the work, not the pay, but the promise of emptiness, a place where nothing could reach me. I was desperate for that emptiness. The first time I stepped inside, I noticed how quiet it was. Not the kind of quiet that welcomes, but the kind that waits. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and the echo of my own footsteps sounded foreign, like a warning. Dust covered surfaces in patterns that suggested some invisible hand had traced them over the years. I ran my fingers over the railing, and the metal felt colder than it should have been. The lighthouse smelled of damp stone, old oil, and something faintly metallic like iron in water. A small notice on the door caught my eye. Certain areas are restricted. Rules must be followed. Failure will result in consequences. I smiled at the thought of rules in a place like this. Who was going to enforce them? I assumed it was a formality, part of some old caretaker protocol. Still, the words lingered longer than I expected. There was a subtle authority in them, even if no one was around to enforce it. The first night was restless. The wind howled, and I thought I heard someone whisper my name over the roar of the waves. When I pressed my ear to the wall, there was only the echo of the storm outside. Shadows stretched in strange angles, thrown by the light of a single flickering bulb. I found myself double-checking doors, closets, and hallways, feeling that small, inexplicable urge to stop. Something wasn't right here. Something that didn't belong to the lighthouse or the ocean, but existed in the spaces between them. By the time morning came, I had convinced myself it was all in my head, but even in the light, the air was thick with a presence I couldn't name. I didn't feel alone. I could feel the house. No, the lighthouse, watching me, waiting for me to learn its rules, and perhaps waiting for me to forget mine. I made a cup of tea, sat by the window, and stared at the jagged coastline. That's when I noticed a small room at the back, its door slightly ajar despite all other doors being firmly shut. The hinges were old and groaned, as if complaining about being touched. A chill ran down my spine, but curiosity, as always, was stronger. Something told me I shouldn't go in. Something else whispered that I would, and I had a strange feeling that once I did, the lighthouse would change. Permanently. The morning I arrived in earnest. The fog had lifted just enough to reveal the cliffs in sharp relief, jagged teeth against the gray sea. I parked my car in the gravel lot at the base of the lighthouse. The engine's hum swallowed almost instantly by the roar of the ocean. My bags were heavier than I remembered, though perhaps that was the weight of anticipation, or the weight of knowing I was about to cross a threshold I could never uncross. The caretaker who met me was older than I expected, a man with hands like gnarled roots and eyes that seemed to have absorbed decades of salt and storm. He introduced himself simply as Corbin. His voice was low, deliberate, as though every word carried consequence. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he nodded once and motioned toward the lighthouse. "You'll need to understand the rules," he said. "They're not suggestions." I followed him inside, my footsteps echoing along the narrow stone corridor. The interior smelled faintly of brine and old wood, with a sharp temps of metal underneath. Dust motes drifted in the beams of sunlight that slipped through the high windows. I noticed for the first time that some doors were reinforced, as if behind them lay something that needed guarding. And I noticed, too, the subtle way Corbin's eyes lingered on those doors before he glanced at me. He handed me a small notebook, its leather cover cracked and worn. Inside were the rules, numbered and precise. "Do not enter the upper rooms without permission. Never light the lantern after midnight. Do not answer if someone knocks between 1 and 3 a.m. Do not attempt to communicate with the sea beyond the east wall. Do not follow voices you hear in the fog. Do not touch the artifacts in the west chamber. Always lock the inner doors before leaving the lighthouse unattended." He didn't explain them. He didn't need to. "They exist for a reason," he said simply. "Ignore them at your own peril." There was no admonishment in his tone, only certainty. And in that certainty, I sensed a truth I couldn't yet name. These rules were not bureaucratic, not ceremonial. They were survival. I spent the afternoon unpacking, exploring the lower floors, and familiarizing myself with the basic functions: cleaning, checking the lamps, keeping the logs. Everything seemed normal, almost mundane, but the rules lingered in the corners of my mind, insistent, unyielding. I found myself pausing at doors I was allowed to enter, wondering what lay beyond the ones I wasn't. Corbin left around sunset, warning me to be careful. "The wind carries more than salt and storm," he said. "Listen carefully. The house will tell you what it wants. But the sea has its own patience." His words unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I watched him drive away, the tires crunching gravel until he disappeared into the fog, leaving me alone with the lighthouse and the strange rhythm of its silence. Night came slowly, the kind of night where shadows deepen without effort, where the walls themselves seem to breathe. I lit the lamps on the lower floors, careful not to touch anything forbidden. The air was cold, not just from the wind outside, but from something deeper, something older. Every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the glass, seemed to carry intent. I tried to follow a routine, as Corbin suggested: meals at fixed times, log entries, maintenance checks, and yet, despite my attempts at normalcy, unease settled like a second skin. I realized that the rules weren't just about safety. They were about boundaries, boundaries I didn't fully understand. Boundaries that had been carefully drawn to protect something, or perhaps, to keep something in. By the time I forced myself to sleep, I could hear it, the faintest of sounds from above, almost imperceptible, like someone moving through a corridor long abandoned. My heart quickened, but I told myself it was the wind, the house settling. But even as I repeated the explanation, a nagging doubt took hold. The rules, Corbin, the locked doors, they weren't warnings, they were signs. Signs that I had entered a place that did not welcome intrusion. I woke briefly before dawn, drawn to the east wall by a sound that might have been a whisper, might have been the sea itself. I didn't move. I didn't touch anything. The house was silent again, but the feeling lingered. I was being observed, and the rules, written plainly in that notebook, suddenly felt like the fragile barrier between order and something far older, something patient, watching from the dark corners of the lighthouse by sunrise. I understood that this place demanded more than just work. It demanded attention, vigilance, obedience, and yet, even as I tried to reassure myself, I knew the questions were beginning. Why these rules? Why this place? And most importantly, What would happen if I ever broke them? I thought I had been careful. I had followed every rule, every instruction, every precaution Corbin had stressed. And yet, curiosity gnawed at me, subtle and insistent, like the tide eroding cliffs over centuries. There was one door on the upper floor, its paint faded and splintered, that I had passed a dozen times without thought. Each time, the warning in the notebook whispered, "Do not enter the upper rooms without permission." That night, the wind was particularly sharp, rattling the panes and carrying a faint metallic scent from somewhere distant. I could hear the sea pounding against the cliffs, each wave striking with deliberate insistence, and somewhere beneath it, almost inaudible, was a soft hum. The hum was low at first, then began to swell, filling the corners of the lighthouse with vibration. I told myself it was the storm, the old building reacting, but the sound drew me toward the forbidden door. My hand lingered on the doorknob, cold, as if it had been chilled by some unseen presence. A voice, almost a whisper, seemed to seep from the cracks around the frame. Just a peek, I shook my head, stepped back, and reminded myself of the rules. And yet, the pull was magnetic. I had to know what lay beyond. I opened the door a fraction. Darkness stretched inside, thick and tangible, swallowing the weak beam of my flashlight. The floorboards inside were slick, and the air smelled of decay, iron, and something I could not name. I stepped over the threshold, more out of instinct than courage, and felt the temperature drop sharply. My breath became visible, misting in the dim light, though the rest of the lighthouse had felt normal only moments before. Then I heard it, the softest scrape, like fingernails on wood, coming from the far corner of the room. My heart hammered in my chest. I froze, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. There was nothing to see, just the darkness pressing back at me. The hum from below had deepened, resonating through the floor, through my bones. I should have retreated. I knew I should have. A shadow moved across the far wall, slow, deliberate, impossibly fluid. I blinked, and it was gone. My rational mind told me it was an illusion, a trick of the light, the wind, or fatigue. But the instinctive knowledge, the one that has kept me alive in quiet, careful ways for decades, told me otherwise. Something had noticed. Something had marked me. I stepped back toward the door. The hum below ceased abruptly, replaced by silence so absolute it felt heavy. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and waits. The door wouldn't budge. My hands shook as I tried again. Then I felt it, a presence behind me, close enough that the heat of it brushed my neck. I didn't dare turn. I whispered the rules aloud, hoping that repetition could anchor me. Finally, the door eased open, releasing me back into the corridor. I bolted down the stairs, not stopping until I reached the main floor. My hands were numb, my pulse a roaring drum in my ears. I told myself I had seen nothing, touched nothing forbidden. But the notebook, sitting on the counter where I had left it, seemed different. The edges were damp, and the leather cover had a subtle pulse, almost like a heartbeat. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the lantern, watching the fog crawl along the cliffs, feeling as though the lighthouse itself was holding its breath. When I finally drifted into restless half-sleep, I dreamt of the upper room, the shadow, and the hum, and the voice that whispered just before I woke, "Next time, you won't leave so easily." The first violation had been subtle, almost imperceptible, yet I felt its weight in my chest. I had crossed the threshold. I had broken the boundary, and somewhere, deep in the house, I knew that the lighthouse, or whatever lived in it, had taken note. The days after that first incident were strange. The lighthouse seemed to have settled, but I had not. Every creak, every distant groan of the wind against stone, seemed magnified, threaded with meaning I couldn't yet comprehend. I kept to the rules more strictly now, at least in theory, but the second one, never light the lantern after midnight, hovered in my mind like a silent warning, It was late when the fog rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the cliffs and turning the horizon into a gray void. I had been sitting by the window, scanning the coast with binoculars, noting nothing but waves and rocks. The hour passed unnoticed until I realized the small lamp at the top of the lighthouse had gone out. The storm had claimed it, most likely, but instinct, a mixture of duty and fear, drew me upward. I climbed the spiral staircase slowly, each step a careful negotiation with the shadows that seemed to shift and lengthen in response to my movement. The notebook's warning echoed in my mind, never light the lantern after midnight. And yet, my hands trembled as I fumbled with the matches, and I found myself striking one anyway. One small flame, tiny and wavering. And then I was lighting the lantern. The moment the flame touched the wick, the air changed. It wasn't the wind or the storm. The lighthouse seemed to inhale sharply, and a low resonant vibration hummed through the walls. I froze, staring out at the fog, expecting to see nothing but gray. But in the mist, shapes moved, shadows that weren't cast by the rocks or the waves, but by something else entirely. They coalesced just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow, dark and indistinct, yet aware. A whisper drifted on the wind, faint but unmistakable. "Why do you defy me?" I couldn't tell if it was the house, the sea, or something older still. My breath hitched, and my fingers went rigid on the iron railing. I wanted to put out the flame, to retreat to safety, but the smoke of the lamp seemed to linger in the air, thick and purposeful, as if reluctant to let me go. Then came the sound, footsteps, echoing on stone, deliberate and heavy. They were not mine. They didn't belong to anyone I could see, or to anyone alive. My pulse quickened, my hands slick with sweat, yet I could not leave. My eyes scanned the fog beyond the railing, catching fleeting forms, shapes that slipped just out of focus. I felt watched, hunted, as if the lantern had illuminated more than the coast. It had illuminated attention, scrutiny, an awareness that chilled me to the bone. I stumbled backward, nearly falling, and the flame flickered violently. In that brief, flickering moment, I thought I saw a figure at the edge of the light, tall, hunched, indistinct, yet unmistakably present, and then it vanished. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. The fog pressed against the glass, as if trying to get inside. My hands shook, and I realized the rules were not merely about keeping order. They were about survival. The lighthouse was not neutral. It was active. It was alive in a way I hadn't understood. When I finally descended to the lower floors, the notebook sat innocuously on the counter, but the page that listed the second rule seemed to quiver slightly, as if it were aware of what I had done. The weight of what I had ignored pressed against me, a silent, unforgiving judgment. I had crossed the line again, and I could feel the consequences settling around me. Subtle at first, but undeniable. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the main hall, listening to the wind, listening to the faint, deliberate thrum that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps above me, or a whisper in the hall, asking questions I could not answer. The rules had begun to make sense, but they made sense in a language I did not yet fully understand, a language of attention, of patience, of threat. By morning, the fog had lifted, but I knew it wasn't just fog that I had to worry about. It was something patient, waiting, learning, and I understood, for the first time, that the lighthouse was no longer just a place. It was a presence, and it would not forgive carelessness. After the incident with the lantern, I avoided the upper floors entirely. I kept to the lower levels, pretending that obedience would shield me from whatever watched. But the curiosity that had led me into the forbidden rooms once, and the recklessness that had drawn me to light the lantern, was not so easily tamed. I knew the rules were more than suggestions. They were protective lines, drawn by someone who had understood the lighthouse in ways I could not. I needed answers. It began with the journals I found tucked behind the main counter, under a loose floorboard that had been long hidden. They belonged to previous keepers, though the earliest entries predated memory and record. The handwriting was uneven, shaking, as if the author had been in constant fear or in constant cold. Each journal told a similar story. The sea carried voices. The lighthouse was alive. Boundaries existed that could not be crossed. And in each, a warning, always the same. Do not break the rules. Do not tempt what waits. One entry, dated almost a century ago, described a keeper named Elias Thorne. He had been ambitious, reckless, dismissive of the boundaries set by his predecessor. He had entered the upper floors, lit the lantern after midnight, and attempted to communicate with the fog. His entries grew increasingly erratic, scribbled with rage and panic. The final note ended mid-sentence. It watches. It waits. It knows. I am, and then nothing. The page after that was blank, save for a small stain that looked like dried salt water and something else, something darker. As I read, the lighthouse seemed to pulse subtly, almost like it was listening. The wind outside shifted, carrying faint whispers I could not comprehend, words half-formed, teasing the edge of understanding. I realized then that the rules were not arbitrary, but derived from knowledge passed down through those who had survived. And yet, some knowledge had not survived, leaving only the warnings. The next discovery came unexpectedly. Behind a false panel in the lower hallway, I found an old set of security logs. The camera feeds had long since decayed, the tapes warped by humidity and age, but the audio had preserved something far stranger. Faint voices, chanting or muttering, interspersed with silence and a sound like scraping stone. Occasionally, a shadow appeared, fleeting, almost imperceptible, moving against the flow of the footage. One frame showed a figure, pale and elongated, standing at the top of the spiral staircase, its face hidden, its posture deliberate. The timestamp read to A.M. I spent days piecing together fragments from journals, tapes, and old notes. The lighthouse had been a station of observation, yes, but also a containment. There was mention of the east wall, a barrier between the building and something unnamed. The sea itself seemed a part of this containment, or perhaps a warning mechanism. Keepers had been entrusted not just with the building, but with what the building held, and those who failed, like Elias Thorne, were consumed by it, leaving only fragments behind for the next to learn. Then I found the most disturbing artifact, a small, intricately carved box hidden behind a false drawer in Corbin's quarters. Inside were fragments of bone, sea-worn, and tiny pieces of paper with illegible writing, torn and water-stained. I felt an immediate, instinctive dread at touching it. The air thickened, as though the room itself exhaled in warning, and yet I could not stop. The fragments seemed to hum faintly, a vibration beneath my fingers that resonated through my bones. Piecing it together, I realized the lighthouse was more than stone and metal. It was a sentinel, a trap, a warning, and a prison all at once. The rules were its mechanism, limits to enforce containment, to keep something from spilling beyond its walls, to prevent whatever watched from reaching the world outside. Each rule I had broken, the first with the upper room, the second with the lantern, had not gone unnoticed. The hum, the shadow, the presence I had felt. They were responses, signals, threats. I began to understand the scale. The journals hinted at more than one entity, or perhaps one entity that shifted form with intent. Keepers had disappeared, vanished into the fog, leaving the lighthouse intact but haunted. The warnings, the whispers, the strange vibrations, all were defensive measures, meant to condition the next caretaker to understand without forcing comprehension. By the time I pieced together the final fragment, a torn note, mentioning a ritual of the West Chamber and the voices beneath the cliffs, I understood that ignorance was no longer an option. Knowledge was the only defense, and even that was tenuous. The lighthouse did not punish indiscriminately. It tested, It observed. It prepared for those who failed to respect its boundaries. And I realized with a sinking certainty that I was now part of the history I had been reading, a keeper in training, a witness, and, if I failed, a warning for the next. The shadows in the hall seemed to stretch longer as I sat cross-legged on the floor, journals open, maps and notes scattered around me. The air smelled faintly of iron and seaweed, and I felt the walls lean closer, listening, waiting. I could almost hear the sigh of the ocean itself, carrying messages I could not yet interpret, and I understood, finally, that there was no turning back. Knowledge had come at a cost, awareness, and awareness brought responsibility. When I looked out at the cliffs, the fog curling over the rocks, I knew something waited there, patient and silent. Something that had watched the mistakes of keepers long dead, and now watched me. And though I tried to steel myself, to treat it all with logic and preparation, a deep, persistent unease settled in my chest. The lighthouse was no longer merely a building. It was a living history, and I had become part of it. The night the encounter began, the fog had rolled in thick and suffocating, curling over the cliffs like fingers. The lighthouse groaned around me, each creak of stone and wood amplified in the silence. I had spent hours poring over journals and notes, piecing together fragments of the past, trying to understand the boundaries I had already crossed. And yet, I had not prepared for this. I did not anticipate being hunted. It began subtly. The temperature dropped, far colder than the winds should have caused. My breath fogged in the air as I descended the spiral staircase to the lower floors. The hum I had come to associate with the lighthouse's awareness began again, low at first, almost imperceptible. I thought I could control my breathing, slow my heart, convince myself it was merely the building settling. But then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, not my own. Heavy, deliberate, pacing in a rhythm that felt unnatural, deliberate. They came from above, the forbidden upper floors, yet I could feel them in my chest, in the vibration of the walls. I froze, listening, straining to locate the source. The shadows in the hall deepened, stretching unnaturally, as if the building itself were bending the light to reveal something that should not be seen. A whisper followed, faint at first, almost drowned by the wind. "You shouldn't be here." The voice carried no accent, no tone, only authority, and it seemed to come from all directions at once. My pulse quickened, and instinct screamed for me to run. I wanted to leave, to escape the presence that had awakened, but my legs refused to move. The rules, the journals, the warnings I had studied, they were not merely protective. They were instructions for survival. Then I saw it, a shadow on the wall, malformed, fluid, moving as if alive, yet wrong in every dimension. It slithered along the hallway, elongating and contracting, brushing against the corners as though feeling its way toward me. I couldn't distinguish face or limbs, only intent. Every instinct told me to flee, but part of me, the part that had always been curious, wanted to see it, to understand what I was facing. The first contact was auditory, a scraping, like nails on stone, circling behind me, following my every movement. I spun, flashlight raised, and caught a glimpse of a figure standing at the staircase. Its form was indistinct, but I knew instinctively it was waiting, testing, aware of every misstep I made. My hands shook, and I realized that my every heartbeat, every breath, was known to it. I ran, descending the stairs 2 at a time, the hum swelling into a low roar. The flashlight flickered, throwing the hallway into darkness intermittently. In those brief shadows, the figure followed, stretching impossibly, appearing and disappearing at will. I reached the main floor and slammed the door behind me, but I could feel its presence pressing against the wood, leaning against the barrier, as if it were nothing more than paper. The wind howled through the cracks, carrying a chorus of whispers, each overlapping the last. The rules. The rules. You have failed again. Panic surged. but I knew I could not scream. Sound seemed to draw it closer. I had to remain silent, still, patient, the way the journals had instructed. The lighthouse had become a predator and a guide all at once, and I was trapped in its curriculum of fear. I stumbled into the east corridor, toward the wall the journals had warned about. The presence followed, relentless. I could hear it in the vibration of the floor, feel it in the shadows, pressing at my feet. My mind raced, recalling every detail of past keepers, every warning about the lantern, the upper rooms, the fog. The rules had been designed to protect, to teach, and I had broken them all. Then came the first physical sensation, a brush against my shoulder, cold and deliberate, as if fingers had grazed my skin without touching it. I froze, stifling a scream, and felt it press closer, probing, testing my reaction. The whispers rose, unintelligible but urgent, a chorus of accusation and anticipation. I realized that this was not a single entity, but an accumulation of all the presences that had been contained, all the mistakes of keepers past made manifest. I fled to the west chamber, the room that held the artifacts, the one I had not yet dared touch. The air was thick with dust and salt, but it seemed almost to push back the entity, or perhaps to confuse it. I barricaded myself briefly, gasping, listening to the movement outside the walls. Every sound, scrape, whisper, heartbeat was magnified. I understood then that the lighthouse was no longer just a building. It was a living maze, a trap, a teacher, and a hunter. Hours passed. Time became meaningless. The presence would ebb and flow, approaching, retreating, testing my vigilance. I understood finally that there would be no mercy, no lull long enough to fully relax. Each misstep, each hesitation, could be my last. And yet, in the darkness, I found a thread of clarity. Knowledge was my only weapon, vigilance my only shield. When dawn finally broke, the entity retreated. The shadows stretched back into corners, the hum faded to a low murmur, and the lighthouse returned to its deceptive calm. But I was changed. I knew, with absolute certainty, that the rules were not suggestions, the warnings not idle. I had survived the first true encounter, but survival came at a cost. Awareness of the force that now stalked me, patient and deliberate, waiting for the next mistake. And as I traced my trembling fingers over the notebook, I realized that the lighthouse had become more than a building. It was a sentinel, a sentient force, and a cage, and I had stepped squarely into its curriculum of fear. Corbin had always seemed infallible, the one person who understood the lighthouse, its rules, and its rhythm, until the night he disappeared. I had been pacing the lower floors, recovering from the encounter with the presence that stalked the upper levels, when I noticed the small office door ajar. It had never been left open before. Inside, the desk was appended, papers scattered across the floor, and in the center of the chaos was a note, written in Corbin's unmistakable hand. Do not trust the rules. Do not trust me. For a moment, I froze. A part of me wanted to dismiss it as some prank, some cruel joke, but instinct told me otherwise. The air was heavy, almost metallic, and I could feel the subtle shift in the lighthouse, the quiet hum of awareness, watching, responding. Corbin had always warned me about vigilance, but it was clear now that he was hiding something far more personal. I searched the lower floors, calling his name, but there was no response. No footsteps, no shuffling through hallways, no presence behind closed doors. Just silence and the feeling that the walls themselves had absorbed him. And then I noticed the artifact in the west chamber, the one I had never dared touch. It was gone. Corbin had taken it, or perhaps something had. The journals hinted at what I already suspected. Past keepers had recorded instances where a mentor, entrusted with the knowledge of the lighthouse, had betrayed the rules, had been consumed by greed or curiosity, and had disappeared. Some had returned, changed, cryptic, or even hostile. Others were never seen again. And now, I understood. Corbin's disappearance was not random. It was deliberate, or enforced. I found a hidden passage behind the spiral staircase, one I had never noticed despite days of careful exploration. It led downward into tunnels carved into the cliffs beneath the lighthouse. The air was damp, and the walls felt alive, vibrating slightly, almost breathing. I could hear faint whispers, fragmented and incomprehensible, but with a tone I recognized Corbin's voice, calling for help, mocking me, or warning me. I could not tell. The deeper I went, the more I realized the truth. Corbin had been part of the lighthouse's secret, a keeper and a test subject simultaneously. He had not merely been instructing me. He had been shaping me, preparing me to understand, to survive, or perhaps to fail. The betrayal was twofold. First, in disappearing, leaving me without guidance, and second in revealing, in the smallest way, that the rules I had trusted were only part of the truth. In the tunnels, I found remnants of what might have been him, a coat, torn and soaked, a journal filled with desperate notes, and a single photograph Corbin standing beside a previous keeper, both of them smiling in an unnatural way, the lighthouse looming behind them, almost sentient in the image. The caption read, "They never leave willingly." My stomach turned. I realized then that the mentor I had trusted was not merely fallible, but complicit in the very system that hunted keepers who broke the rules. And the thought that chilled me most, Corbin had either survived the consequences of past violations or had been transformed by them. His disappearance was a lesson, a warning, and a secret I was only now uncovering. The lighthouse did not merely enforce rules, it used those who understood them as agents, intermediaries, or sacrifices. And Corbin's role, once reassuring, had shifted. He was now a symbol of the cost of knowledge, a reminder that trust was as dangerous as curiosity. When I emerged back into the main hall, the fog outside had thickened, curling over the cliffs with a deliberate patience. The lighthouse hummed softly, almost in acknowledgement, and I realized I had been left to navigate its trials alone. The mentor I had relied upon had vanished into shadows, leaving me to confront the entity and the rules without guidance. And yet, even in that isolation, I felt a lingering thread of Corbin's influence. Perhaps he had left the note for a reason, a final hint that obedience alone would not guarantee survival. Perhaps betrayal, deception, and vigilance were all part of the curriculum. The lighthouse demanded more than compliance. It demanded awareness, cunning, and sometimes a willingness to face truths too heavy to bear. As I stood by the spiral staircase, staring at the shadows that now seemed to shift with purpose, I understood that nothing was as it had seemed. The mentor was gone, the rules only partially revealed, and the force within the lighthouse remained patient, deliberate, and infinitely watchful. I was on my own, and in the quiet that followed, I realized the true danger. The lighthouse did not simply punish, it learned, and it would remember me. By the time the fog thickened around the cliffs, I understood the choice before me: obey the rules blindly and remain trapped in the lighthouse's curriculum, or break them and risk the consequences, desperate for escape. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet another part of me, the part sharpened by knowledge and fear, knew that running would not guarantee freedom. The lighthouse was patient. It waited. It remembered. I gathered what I could: the notebook with the rules, my flashlight, and a small pack of supplies. I moved quietly through the lower floors, keeping close to walls and corners, listening for the hum, the whispers, the subtle vibrations that signaled the presence's attention. I knew now that each rule had a purpose, not merely to constrain, but to contain. And I had already broken some. Every violation had been noted, every hesitation recorded in the building's awareness. The first choice was the upper floors. I had avoided them since my first transgression, yet they now called to me with an urgency I could not ignore. The shadows seemed to stretch toward the staircase, beckoning, threatening. I climbed slowly, each step a negotiation with fear itself. The presence was there, waiting, or perhaps watching, its attention a physical weight pressing against my chest. I reminded myself of the journals, of past keepers, of Corbin's hidden warnings. Knowledge was my shield. Halfway up, the wind shifted, rattling windows and door frames. I heard movement behind me, deliberate, slow, almost testing me. I froze, listening, and then understood. Retreat would trigger pursuit. Only forward movement, deliberate and careful, could buy me time. My hands were numb, my heart hammering, but I continued. Each step was measured, each breath silent, each glance fleeting. The upper floors held secrets I had never fully grasped, and I now understood they were my only chance to confront what hunted me at the top. The air was thick and cold. The fog outside pressed against the glass like a living thing. I reached for the lantern, knowing the rule forbade me from lighting it after midnight, yet understanding that without illumination, I would be blind in the face of what I had summoned. I hesitated, then struck the match, the flame flickering weakly before steadying. Shadows danced along the walls, long and fluid, yet I felt no immediate attack. The presence seemed to pause, watching my decision, weighing my intent. Then came the voices, not one, but many, overlapping, whispering, pleading, warning. Turn back, do not touch, obey. I realized that the final decision would not be simple obedience or simple defiance. Survival required cunning, a willingness to balance between fear and action. I closed my eyes, letting the knowledge of past keepers guide me, and stepped toward the east wall, the barrier described in the journals. Beyond it, I sensed the faint stirrings of the entity, the force that had stalked me, patient and deliberate. The moment I placed my hand on the wall, a shiver ran through me, and the whispers intensified. The floorboards vibrated, the lantern flickered, and for an instant, the entire lighthouse seemed to exhale. I could feel the presence pressing against me, testing, probing, aware of every heartbeat. And then I remembered Corbin's note. Do not trust the rules. Do not trust me. Survival demanded decision beyond obedience. It demanded initiative. I moved along the wall, following an instinct I did not fully understand. Something shifted beneath my feet, a hidden door giving way to a narrow passage leading downward into the cliffs themselves. The air was damp, salty, and thick with the echoes of past keepers' fear. I hesitated, weighing the choice: remain and continue the perilous game of observation, or descend into the unknown in a desperate bid for freedom. I chose the latter, my heart beat a drum in the suffocating silence. The passage wound downward, twisting and narrowing, the presence following but restrained somehow by the walls. I could hear it occasionally, a low hum, whispers brushing against my consciousness, testing my resolve, but I kept moving, letting instinct and knowledge guide me. Each step brought me closer to the cliffs, closer to the fog, closer to the tenuous promise of escape. Finally, I emerged onto the jagged rocks, the ocean crashing below in chaotic rhythm. The fog enveloped me, thick and suffocating. Yet there was air here, space to move, and the faint possibility of survival. I paused, looking back at the lighthouse, towering and indifferent, shadows stretching toward me like fingers. I understood then that escape would not sever my connection, nor erase the lessons I had learned. The lighthouse remembered, and it would wait, patient and deliberate, for the next keeper to arrive. I took a step forward, then another, feeling the spray of salt water on my face, the cold stone beneath my boots. Survival had been won, for now, but at a cost: knowledge, fear, and the certainty that the presence within the lighthouse would never forget me. And as the fog swallowed the building from view, I realized the truth I could not deny. Freedom in the lighthouse's world was temporary, fragile, and always under observation. The fog swallowed the cliffs, turning the world into a gray void. I thought I had escaped, leaving the lighthouse behind like a relic of nightmares I would never return to. My boots sank into wet sand, the ocean roaring beneath me, and for a moment, I felt the fragile relief of survival. The wind carried nothing but the smell of salt and storm moor, so I told myself, but the sensation of being watched returned. Subtle at first, a prickling along the back of my neck. I stopped and scanned the horizon, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing, and then I saw it, a faint light glimmering through the fog, impossibly distant, yet unmistakable. The top of the lighthouse, it was still standing, still glowing faintly, and somehow aware. A whisper brushed against my ear, indistinct but certain, "You cannot leave." My stomach churned as I realized the truth I had been avoiding. The lighthouse was patient. It did not forgive. It did not forget, no matter how far I ran, no matter how desperate my choices. It would find a way to draw me back, or to shape the next chapter of this cycle. I pressed forward along the shore, hoping the fog would hide me, hoping the tide would claim me before it could. Yet with each step, I felt the weight of countless eyes, past keepers, and something older still. All observing, all judging, all waiting. The notebooks, the journals, Corbin's warnings, they were not history. They were invitations, chains, and guides. The lighthouse was more than a building. It was a force, and I was now entwined in its design. At the edge of the water, I paused, breathless, listening. The wind carried voices, the distant hums, whispers, and echoes of keepers who had come before. Some had vanished, some had returned, changed, and now I understood that my escape was only temporary. The rules, the presence, the walls themselves had marked me. I had survived the encounter, but survival did not mean freedom. It meant observation. It meant inevitability. And then I saw movement in the fog, a shadow gliding along the shoreline, deliberate, patient, unhurried. My pulse quickened, though I knew it was only a matter of time. The lighthouse had not forgotten, and neither had what it contained. My footsteps slowed, hesitant, and I realized the cycle was not broken. It had only begun anew. The wind carried the faintest sound of a creaking door, a hinge swinging open, and a whisper that chilled me deeper than the spray of the sea. Next time, my turn to run, but the fog seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. The cliffs, the rocks, the ocean itself, all felt like extensions of the lighthouse, as though I had never truly left. I understood then that escape was a myth. Survival was a temporary pause in the rhythm of inevitability, and as the whisper came again, clearer this time, I realized the most horrifying truth. I was never outside. I had only moved within the perimeter it controlled, and I would never leave. The lighthouse waited. I would return, and in the silence between the waves, I could hear it laughing. Or perhaps that was me, echoing across the fog, already part of the cycle I could not escape.